We'll go ahead and turn to Psalm 1. We're in the book of Psalms tonight. We'll get to Psalm 1 in a little while, but we're going to do a few little introductory remarks to get us kind of introduced to the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is one of those books that is classified as being poetry. It's important for us to understand that because poetry is so different from other types of literature in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. Because when you look at poetry like Proverbs and the book of Psalms, the poets would write with a whole different style. There was not the style of the prophets. There was no essay like you would have among the prophets. Remember, we studied Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and you look at those, and they're kind of, especially Haggai, would be the kind of essay I'd like to write, 1.5 pages. That's the kind of essay I like. But it's kind of like an essay. With the books of poetry, the authors of the Old Testament poetry are not trying to write an essay, but what they're trying to do is paint a picture. They're trying to use words to communicate in a way that would cause your mind to engage and to understand the picture that they're painting. And it might be very short to the point. It might be only a sentence. It might be only a phrase. It might be a paragraph, but the thing about it is the kind of language that paints a picture. For instance, one of the things that you're going to see throughout the book of Psalms is that the authors of the Psalms are going to use a lot of figures of speech. They're going to use those really flowery terms that are going to describe things in a lot of different ways. And they're going to use ways to describe God Himself that would put Him in human form, the way that He has hands or ears or eyes or feet or whatever, that's giving Him human form. In the Psalms, God is also given the characteristics of animals, talking about like wings of eagles or something like that, demonstrating or giving color to the truth of God's Word. That's why when you approach the books of poetry, it is interesting to find the meaning that's being given in those particular verses, because it may be, as I said, only a phrase, or it may be a whole verse, it might be a paragraph, but it is the poet's job is to paint in very flowery terms a picture that would help us to be able to see and to visualize the truth that's being taught. Now, one of the ways that they're going to write, and one of the ways they're going to teach, is by this method called parallelism. And what you find there, very simply, is there will be a positive followed by a negative, something like that. And we'll see some of that as we work our way through Psalms. And that is, you see it. It will also sometimes be two positives, just a different way of saying the same thing. And then the next verse may be the negative. And what's compelling about the books of poetry is that even though we are not reading them in the Hebrew, it still has a rhythm and a poetry feel to it, even though we're reading it in a language that it wasn't written in. I find that very fascinating, because most of the time when you translate poetry, it really loses any rhyme or rhythm or anything that it may have had. But the poetry of the Old Testament seems to hold on to a lot of that. And when we think of poetry, I don't know about you, but what little bit of English literature I had in high school and in college, Most of that had to do with either prose or rhyme. I always grew up listening to or reading or hearing rhyme, because when you listen to country music, it's almost all rhyme, isn't it? That's just a poem, it's just a story, and it rhymes. Sometimes they have to really work to make them rhyme, and they really have to pull words out of the air to make them rhyme, but I'm used to rhythm. I don't know how old I was when I learned it, but if somebody says something that rhymes off the cuff and they didn't mean to, I said, "You're a poet and don't know it. You rhyme every time, get worse every verse." I'm used to poetry that rhymes. The Hebrews didn't write poetry that rhymes. They wrote different styles of poetry, but it was not a poetry that rhymed. It didn't end with the same word. It didn't. Think about our hymns that we sing on Sunday morning, or our hymns that we sing when we gather together. A lot of those do the very same thing. They will end and have a rhyming word for the next stanza or the next phrase. There's often that rhyming, but the Hebrew poetry didn't do that. As a matter of fact, sometimes they use acrostic style, which would be to use each one of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and they would begin it with a word with that letter of the Hebrew alphabet, being an acrostic. So we kind of understand that. But the concept behind Hebrew poetry was to make a point by using the license of poetry as a spiritual tool to communicate God's Word and to communicate God's will. Now, the thing that points to the reason that they would do that is that many of these psalms would be psalms that were sung by the Hebrew nation, by the Hebrew people, as they are on their way to worship, as they are in worship, or as they are on their way home from worship, or they would be psalms that would be sung as they gathered their children together, maybe for the nighttime little devotional that you had for the family, and you're able to sing these songs, these hymns, these psalms in those settings. Now, some of these weren't necessarily meant to be sung corporately like that. Some of them were more individual. The ones that seem to identify themselves as being to lean toward the idea of them being used by the congregation would be the kind of psalms that they call royal psalms. The royal psalms would be those psalms that would talk about the king, that would talk about God, that would talk about God's blessings, that would in some way infer or refer to God and His blessings and the king, and all of those would be royal in nature. There are other psalms that are classified as, I'll just say, Congregational Lamentations. We know what the book of Lamentation is about. And we know what a lamentation is. To lament is to sorrow, or is to express great grief and pain and struggle. That would be a lamentation. Now, some of the psalms are a lamentation that would be coming from the congregation. Others would be a lamentation coming from an individual. For instance, when David writes his Lamentations, that might be specifically pointed toward David himself. Now, could you use that in a worship setting? Could the Israelites have used it? I'm sure they could have, and it's very likely that they did use some of them, but there are those that gave themselves more traditionally to that idea of being used in worship that might be what we call community or congregational lamentations. Now, I've already mentioned that a lot of these psalms are really what we would call hymns. They are worship songs, and many of them are in that category of being worship hymns or worship songs. Another category of psalms that we see a lot is the thanksgiving psalms. You don't have to read very far. As a matter of fact, sometimes they're grouped together. You don't have to read very far till you find thanksgiving psalms. If you were here Sunday night, I read the last 5 psalms, 45, 46, 145, 6, 7, 8, 9. I read 150. Anyway, I read those last psalms, at least the first couple of verses of each one, and you might recognize that being grouped together in that way, and their theme came out very quickly, and that was praise the Lord, praise God, praise Him, give Him glory, honor Him, esteem Him. And that was what the theme was of all of those that we looked at last Sunday night as our devotional after our singing time. Now, a lot of people immediately, when you say the book of Psalms, if I were to ask you who wrote the book of Psalms, most folks will say David. That's only about 3/4 of the truth, because he wrote about 73 of the Psalms. The rest of them some of them are named, sons of Korah or something like that. And then many of those are unnamed. We have no clue as to who the author is. We really, one commentator that I read said that there are about 50 that are anonymous when it comes to understanding who wrote it or the authorship of it. Now the question might arise, where did the book of Psalms come from? Because the Psalms seem to be a collection of psalms that are written over a very broad period of time, all the way from the time of the kings, when David wrote his, and all the way to the time of the Babylonian captivity. So how did they get together? Most scholars believe that they were put together maybe by Ezra and those that were working with Ezra. You might remember the statement that's made early on about Ezra and his cohorts, his group that would be responsible for putting together the books of the Old Testament. And so it's very likely, according to most, that they gathered these Psalms together, written over a broad span of time, gathered them together to make what we know today as the book of Psalms. And so they put it in one collection. And that would probably have been just a rough number, so we don't try to pin it down too close, but somewhere around 450 BC that the book of Psalms probably was put together in that way. Now also, one of the things that you're going to find in the book of Psalms is that you're going to find sometimes when you will see the writer of that psalm issue a complaint. That is significant because what you have in the book of Psalms oftentimes is raw emotion. We're talking about real people who are writing real things to a God they believe in and about a God they believe in. And as a result of that, what you find is that sometimes there is a dominant theme, which is, I have a complaint. I want to bring this before you. And so there's this opportunity to complain. But if you notice in a couple of David's Psalms, he opens them up with a complaint, but it doesn't take him very long for that to turn, and at least a few verses into it, he'll turn that so that he begins to find the opportunity to ask for forgiveness, and then ultimately he ends with praising God, even though it might begin with a complaint. I have this complaint. I have this issue that I need to bring up before you. And as we bring the issue up, unlike, say, Job and his friends, it kind of heals itself without an intervention from God. It kind of heals itself in that thought process. Now, here's what makes it really tough for us to put a psalm in a particular category, because if you say it is an individual lament or a royal psalm or a psalm of thanksgiving, then there's going to be a couple of verses or a group of verses that are going to totally go off that mark and go in a different direction. So what I'm saying by that is, don't be hard and fast with most of your psalms and say, well, this is a royal psalm, when it could very likely be a psalm of thanksgiving, but it just mentions the idea of the king or God, some of those kind of things as well. So now when you think about the different types of psalms, we've already mentioned the hymns. The best figure that I can come up with is that about 40 of the psalms out of those 150 are what we would call hymns. They would fit that very classic mold of being a hymn. But here's the issue. Each one of those hymns, those psalms that were used for singing praises to God, might fit into a different category, because, for instance, you might have a psalm that really rehearses the history of God's dealing with the people of Israel. So there's a whole new category, isn't it? It's a hymn, but it's a hymn of historical rehearsal. It rehearses how God acted and how God did, and the way that God intervened, and the way that God was present during the time of the difficulty, and those kind of things. So you have those. There are at least 40 of those, and depends on how you change and how you look at some of them. They could fit in other categories as well. I mentioned the laments, the lamentations, the group lament, as well as the individual. There are a lot of those that range from naming a particular physical ailment to physical threat from enemies, anxiety, poverty. There are those that deal with, I'm being persecuted by my enemies, or I'm being persecuted by my own people, or something like that would deal with something that would cause the individual to cry out to God and complain. That would be that lament. So you have those two that would really fit together, and there are some special features that we'll talk about when we actually get into a lament. But one of those things is that it really deals with enemies, whether it's the enemy of a nation that's a heathen nation, or it might be the enemy of his own people, or it might be sinfulness. It might be something like that. And also in these lamentation psalms, there often is a time of coming back to God at the end. When you lay it all out there, you lay out all your complaints, what have you got left? When you lay it all out, where do you go? Well, I've got one place to go, and that's to God. So that's what we find. There are, as I mentioned, a lot of thanksgiving psalms. Praise, honor, glory, reverence, put all of those together. Some people put the royal psalms in that one, in the thanksgiving psalms, but they seem to have a whole different category to themselves. And then there is the last one that's mentioned sometimes is what they call wisdom psalms. The wisdom psalms are psalms that might sound a little bit like the book of Proverbs. Though we sometimes include Proverbs in this category of being poetry, it is wisdom literature as well as poetry, which, wow, that really creates another whole sheet of paper for us to write about it, because it is wisdom literature and also poetry as well. So some of the Psalms are going to be what we just call simply wisdom psalms. They might have some very short, to the point statements in them. They will give you a truth, maybe parallel that with a way to say that same truth in a second way. There may be that statement of the truth with the negative of that stated also in that same one. And the reason I held this one to last is because Psalm 1 fits that category of being a wisdom psalm. Okay, so we finally made it to Psalm 1. We're there, okay? So Psalm 1 is in that category of being a wisdom psalm because it really reads a lot like the book of Proverbs. Proverbs being wisdom literature. Sometimes these very short statements are answers, are very short answers to a very detailed and long, drawn-out problem. Anybody in here do really well in Algebra 2? Any real math good folks in here? Yeah. Dale did okay. Dale did okay. Mac, did you do good in algebra? No, you didn't. You flunked it? Okay. Well, I would have if it hadn't have been for a couple of folks in that class that really helped me understand it, because the teacher would get through and I'd go, huh? What? But what I'm getting at is I am so shocked at how much I use algebra and geometry in my real life. If I could go back and tell myself then, you're going to use algebra and geometry almost every day in your life, and so you need to learn it, and I would say, okay, all right, to myself, now more wise and more mature, I need to do better on that. Because I do. I use it all the time. You use it all the time. If you cut a board, you use it. If you do anything like that. Don't even get me talking about plumbing and electricity before we go any further. Problem, big problem, right? She fills the board up with this algebra problem. What's the answer? X. Okay, we found the answer. It's X, or X equals 3, or whatever it is. Okay, so here's this big problem on the board. She hands you the test, and on the test takes up half a page with one problem, and the answer is X equals 3, or whatever it is. The psalmist and the writer of Proverbs take that approach. Here's the answer. Short, pithy, straightforward, lays it out there in a very simple way, what seems to be a huge problem in the universe or in the world. Go back to Proverbs. You remember how Proverbs deals with, in very short segments, deals with, I don't know, the struggle of immorality. Little short verses, 2 or 3, 4, 5, or 6 together. Then he moves on to another subject. Wisdom, straight, short, straight to the point. We're going to answer this. If you had to write a paper, explain and give us detailed understanding of wisdom, how many pages is that going to take? Whole binder, right? I mean, 100 pages? 50? I mean, we can't write that many. I mean, somebody could, but the proverb writer, as well as the Psalms, takes those really large issues, social, spiritual, physical, temptation, all of those, and boils them down to short, understandable, straight to the point answers to it. So, these psalms that we call wisdom psalms, I don't know, there are probably about 15 of them that are included in there. I didn't count them exactly, but I think the list I pulled up was probably about 15, something like that. And it is particularly easy to understand. There is a proverb-like feel to it, and you can draw out the meaning particularly easy. Now, one of the things somebody asked one time, why did this make its way into the Old Testament? Why do we have this category of wisdom literature? Why do we have this category of poetry in the Old Testament? Because so much of it's taken up with history, the book of the law, which is the first 5 books, 12 books of history. Then you have all of these, you got 5 major prophets and 12 minor prophets. And so that makes up most of the Old Testament. And then you got these few little books that are classified as either wisdom literature or poetry or both. Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Proverbs, and so you get a pretty good idea of wisdom literature. Job is put in that framework of being wisdom literature. And then you have the connection with what we're talking about tonight, which is poetry. All right, I'm going to stop and let you ask questions or make observations. Any observations you'd like to make? Anything? Now, I'll just let you know up front that in all of that, I didn't near cover all of the things that are possible with the divisions of a psalm. You have a psalm by itself that sits in a class of being a doxology. I don't know. I mean, that's good. It's a Psalm 117, classified as a doxology. So it's short, straight to the point, brings it to a conclusion, wraps it up in a tiny bow. Yes? Well, good. Appreciate that. Yeah. What I want to do is just give us a little bit of insight as we enter in. We're not going to take it one psalm and do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way through. We're going to kind of skip around and hit several of the different types so we get a pretty good feel of what's going on. Anything else? All right, let's look at Psalm 1, and we're not going to go verse by verse and discuss every little bit of meaning here, because I really want us to read it through and kind of see the overall picture of why this is a psalm that would be classified as a wisdom psalm. And of course, I've already told you part of why it is classified as a wisdom psalm, but note as we read through it that it does sound a lot like Proverbs, and it answers a lot of very difficult questions in a very straightforward manner. All right, let's begin. Chapter 1, verse 1. It's not very long, so we can read all the way through it. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. As you look at that, you see the positive that's stated in those first 3 verses, and then in the last 3 verses, the negative is stated. Blessed is the man who, and then he gives us the same concept, but uses different phrases, different words. Who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, does not stand in the way of sinners, did not sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. So you see the way that it's laid out is 3 verses of positive, 3 verses of negative, but then he also says the man who is righteous, the blessed one, is one who does not do these things, but does these things. He doesn't do these, but he does do these. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. Verses 3 through 6 are the negative side of that. Verses 4 through 6 are the negative side of that. The wicked are not so. And then he uses this phrase, but they are like chaff that the wind drives away. They will not stand in judgment, nor in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Now, verse 6 is that classic example of the negative and positive. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So you see the very straightforward positive, negative change there in verse 6. So this is a classic example of a wisdom psalm, and you'll find 15 or so of these as you work your way through the book of Psalms. They are helpful. They answer a lot of questions. They are easy to understand. I mean, people who do not study the Bible can look at that and with very little difficulty understand that, can't they? You don't have to have an understanding of how to study the Bible or a class on how to study the Bible or how to study Bible poetry or anything, because that is just a plain, very straightforward layout of a wisdom psalm. Now, Psalm 2 is the classic example of a royal psalm. Now, later on, starting the next time we meet, we're going to get into some meaning behind some of these, but I want to give you a couple of examples tonight about what we've already talked about. So, number 2, Psalm 2 is really what a classic example of a royal psalm. Some might call it a kingly psalm or something like that. But if you have a title, remember these titles aren't necessarily inspired, but they're put there for a reason. And this title says, in mine, it says, "The Reign of the Lord Almighty." That gives you a hint right up front that this is talking about the royal, the king. This is talking about the king. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, and he goes on to talk about the anointed one of the Lord. He even talks about, you are my son, and he talks about the nation of Israel, and they take refuge in him. So that's a classic example of a royal psalm. Psalm 3 is a classic example of a lamentation. Have you ever read through the book of Lamentation? Yeah, it's quite depressing, isn't it? Poor, woe is me, I'm bad state, everything's wrong. Deborah used to sing to our kids that Nobody loves me. Everybody hates me. Think I'll go eat worms? That one? Okay, yeah. Woe is me. You don't know that one? Yeah. We'll have to teach that to Kim. So it's an individual lamentation or a lament. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there's no salvation for him in God. Well, he closes it out by saying, Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. So, though he started out really looking sad, he ended it by saying, well, there's only one place to find salvation, and that's in the Lord. I didn't leave myself enough time for you to do your homework, so you'll probably have to take that home. But Psalm 4, I'm not going to tell you what kind of psalm it is. Psalm 5 is also a lamentation. It's also a lament. But what is number 4? We have enough time to read it, but not enough time for you to comment. So, let me read it, and then you can, next time we meet, I won't be here next Wednesday, but the following Wednesday, we'll probably pick up here in Psalm 4. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Now, I'll just give you a hint. You might put it in two different categories, and neither one would be wrong. Thanksgiving? That's a pretty good observation. Anybody else want to blurt out an answer? Wisdom? Wisdom, okay. That's a good answer too. All right, I'll leave that one with you there. As I said, 3 and 5 are both individual laments, and then this number 4 kind of between them. Read back over that, and we'll kind of pick up there next week and maybe do some in-depth study in that number 4.